How does a boy born into the chaos of exile, carrying a name that served simultaneously as a divine blessing and a suffocating curse, convince one of the most powerful nations on earth to voluntarily surrender its hard-won republican liberties and crown him its absolute emperor? This is not the plot of a speculative novel. It is the improbable, almost fantastical, true story of Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. His journey represents one of the most remarkable political comebacks in modern history, a masterclass in propaganda and the manipulation of a national myth. To understand him, one must understand the treacherous landscape of post-revolutionary France, a nation exhausted by decades of turmoil, from the bloody terror of the First Republic to the dazzling imperial glory of his uncle to the deeply unpopular Bourbon Restoration. This France was socially fractured, torn between its monarchist past, its republican present, and a deep nostalgia for the power the name Bonaparte represented. Louis Napoleon's singular genius lay in his ability to present himself as the simultaneous solution to all these contradictions. A man who could restore order without being a tyrant, champion the common people without inciting radical revolution, and bring back French glory without plunging Europe into endless war. He was a prince without a throne, a citizen in exile, armed with nothing but a legendary name, a dreamer in a world of harsh realities, and an unshakable belief in his destiny. If you find this astonishing story of ambition, failure, and the complex dance of power fascinating, please help us continue to bring more of this incredible history to life. Take a moment to support our channel by clicking the like button, subscribing for more deep dives into the lives of history's most compelling and controversial figures. Be sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new release. Every subscription helps us research and produce these documentaries. And if you know someone else who loves history as much as you do, please share this documentary with them to help our community grow. His name was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was critically the nephew of the great Napoleon I, a legacy that acted as both a golden key and a heavy chain. The golden key was the immediate name recognition it afforded him. To the French peasantry, who formed the vast majority of the population, the name Napoleon was not associated with tyranny or endless wars, but with stability, the protection of the revolution's land reforms, and, above all, national glory, the glory of Austerlitz. To the army, the name was a call to lost honor. But the heavy chain was just as real. This legacy meant that, from the moment of his birth, he was a political statement, a living threat to the restored Bourbon monarchy and to the concert of Europe. This conservative alliance, forged by the victors of Waterloo, was designed specifically to keep France in check and to stifle the very revolutionary spirit that the Bonapartes embodied. He could never be just a private man. He was a symbol, an heir, and a pretender, forced to live up to a legend that had conquered a continent, a standard that was impossibly high. After the First Empire's definitive fall at Waterloo in 1815, the entire Bonaparte clan was formally and permanently banished from France. Louis Napoleon grew up as a perpetual exile, a man without a country, wandering the aristocratic drawing rooms of Europe. He was raised primarily in Switzerland, at the castle of Ehrenberg, and later in Germany. This upbringing was dominated by his mother, the formidable Hortense de Beauharnais, Napoleon's stepdaughter. Hortense, a true believer in the imperial cult, relentlessly schooled her son in the glory of the Bonapartist legacy, instilling in him an ironclad belief that it was his sacred destiny to one day rule France. The castle of Ehrenberg was less a home than a shrine, a museum dedicated to the memory of the First Empire, where every object whispered of past glories. Here, surrounded by relics of his uncle's swords, uniforms, and letters, Louis Napoleon did not just learn history, absorbed it as a theology. He trained with the Swiss military, becoming an artillery officer, the same branch as his uncle, and wrote extensively, publishing political tracts, like his political reveries. In these writings, he began to craft his unique political philosophy, a fusion of his uncle's authoritarian populism with modern progressive ideas about the state's duty to its people, creating a unique brand of Bonapartism, tailored for the industrial age. But what happens when you try to become Napoleon, the heir to a military genius, but you lack his combat experience and his popular support, and you fail, not just once but twice, in the most humiliating ways imaginable? This is the chapter of Louis Napoleon's life that defines his early reputation. For years, he was not seen as a serious threat by the established monarchies, but as a pathetic joke, a farcical echo of his legendary uncle, as Karl Marx would later write. His early attempts to seize power were so poorly planned and executed that they cemented an international image of him as a bumbling romantic fool, a playboy prince playing at revolution with a naivety that bordered on delusion. This perception, however, would paradoxically become his greatest weapon, as the seasoned politicians of the 1848 revolution would fatally underestimate him, dismissing him as a harmless idiot they could easily control, only to realize too late that the fool was a master tactician. In 1836, at the age of 28, he launched his first serious attempt at a coup in Strasbourg. He chose the city strategically, targeting the 4th Artillery Regiment, the very regiment his uncle had once commanded. Dressed in a custom-made imitation of Napoleon's uniform, he appeared before the soldiers at dawn, declared the Bourbon monarchy overthrown, and expected them to flock to his banner. A few did, confused by the spectacle, but the plot quickly unraveled. The garrison's commanders did not defect, the soldiers remained loyal, and the entire uprising was over in hours. Louis Napoleon was arrested without a single shot being fired in his defense. King Louis Philippe, in a shrewd political move, treated the affair not as high treason, but as the youthful folly of a deluded boy. Instead of a trial that might martyr him, the king simply had him put on a ship and exiled to America, hoping the humiliation would destroy his credibility forever. In 1840, having returned to Europe, he decided to try again. This attempt was even more disastrous and theatrical. He sailed from England with a small band of mercenaries and, according to legend, a tame eagle intended to soar over their landing as an imperial omen. They landed at Boulogne and once again attempted to rally the local garrison. The soldiers were baffled, and the expedition devolved into a chaotic farce. With the invaders being chased down the beach by local troops, Louis Napoleon was captured ignominiously as he tried to flee. This time, the French government was not so lenient. He was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment in the fortress of Ham. Yet this prison became his greatest asset. He called it the University of Ham, and for 6 years he studied and wrote prolifically. It was here he penned The Extinction of Pauperism, a tract outlining a plan to eliminate poverty. This pamphlet became a bestseller, winning him immense popularity among the working class. Then, in 1846, he executed a brilliant escape. He shaved his signature mustache, donned a wig, put on the clothes of a laborer, and carried a heavy plank of wood over his shoulder to hide his face, walking right past the guards who had watched him for years. By 1848, the political winds had shifted dramatically. The king was overthrown, Paris was burning, and the failed prince saw his ultimate opportunity. The stage was set by the collapse of the existing order. King Louis Philippe's July monarchy, which had begun as a liberal alternative, had devolved into a stagnant, corrupt regime, serving only the wealthy elite, ignoring the desperate plight of the working class. A series of bad harvests, a financial crisis, and a ban on political gatherings converged to create a powder keg. In February 1848, the spark was lit, and the people of Paris once again took to the streets, building the barricades that were the signature of French Revolution. The 1848 revolution swiftly toppled King Louis Philippe, who fled to England. France was plunged into the chaotic, idealistic era of the Second Republic. The nation was desperate for a leader who could restore order without restoring the hated monarchy. Louis Napoleon, sensing his moment, rushed back from exile. However, the new Republican government, terrified of his name, ordered him to leave. He smartly complied, playing the role of a law-abiding citizen, and returned to London. This was a masterstroke. By leaving, he avoided the chaotic early months of the Republic, and let the new government take the blame for the economic mess and social unrest, biding his time while the Republic tore itself apart. When he returned to run for the presidency later that year, he campaigned not as a prince, but as a man of the people. His famous name was pure magic, a Rorschach test for the nation's anxieties. To the conservative peasants in the countryside, Bonaparte meant order and the protection of their land. To the army, it promised a return to dignity and glory. To the urban workers, it represented a concern for their plight, a strong leader who would act against the heartless liberals. He brilliantly positioned himself as the man above faction, as the only one capable of uniting a hopelessly divided France. promising order, stability, and prosperity to a nation exhausted by revolution. He won the election by a landslide. In December 1848, France held its first ever direct presidential election. The political establishment backed General Cavaignac, the man who had brutally suppressed the June Days working-class uprising. They dismissed Louis Napoleon as a cretin they could manipulate. They were disastrously wrong. Louis Napoleon won an astonishing 74% of the vote, securing a powerful popular mandate that Cavaignac could not challenge. He had, for the first time, united the countryside, the military, and the working class against the political establishment in Paris. In December 1848, Louis Napoleon was sworn in as the first president of the Second Republic. He took an oath to uphold the Constitution, an oath he had no intention of keeping if it stood in his way. Immediately, he began to act more like a monarch. He toured the country relentlessly, connecting with ordinary people and cultivating his image as the protector of the nation. He presented himself as the guardian of the three pillars of French society: order, religion, and property. This message resonated deeply with a nation still terrified by the socialist uprisings of the June Days, which had raised the specter of a new, radical Red Revolution confiscating property. The Constitution, however, contained a fatal flaw. It forbade the president from seeking a second consecutive term. As his term neared its end in 1851, Louis Napoleon found himself facing a political cliff. He tried to have the Constitution legally amended to allow him to run again, but the National Assembly, suspicious of his intentions, refused. He was trapped. He could either step down and fade into obscurity or seize power by force. For a Bonaparte, there was only one choice. On December 2nd, 1851, the anniversary of his Uncle Est's coronation and the victory at Austerlitz, destroyed the Constitution he had sworn to protect. He called his meticulously planned coup Operation Rubicon. In the early hours, his troops occupied the National Assembly and seized key government buildings. He plastered the city with proclamations dissolving the Assembly, restoring universal suffrage, and declaring a state of siege. His police arrested his primary political opponents in their beds. The Second Republic was effectively dead by sunrise, murdered by its own president. Resistance erupted in Paris, just as he had anticipated. Republican leaders like Victor Hugo tried to rally the people. Barricades went up in the working-class neighborhoods. But this was not 1848. Louis Napoleon was prepared. He responded with overwhelming military force. His troops were ordered to show no mercy. The broad boulevards soldiers fired indiscriminately into crowds, killing hundreds of civilians in the Boulevard Massacre, turning the streets of Paris into a bloody theater of repression. This brutality sent a chilling message that the era of parliamentary debate was over, replaced by the cold steel of the saber. The printing presses of opposition newspapers were smashed or seized, and the cafes where politics were once hotly debated fell silent, filled only with the whispers of informers. It was a piece of the graveyard, purchased at the price of liberty. In the aftermath, thousands were arrested or exiled. Victor Hugo fled into an exile that would last for 2 decades, writing venomous attacks on Napoleon the Small. How do you justify a military coup and the massacre of your own citizens? If you are Louis Napoleon, you hold a vote. This was the genius of his democratic authoritarianism. Just 3 weeks after the coup, with his opposition jailed or silenced, and the press censored, he held a plebiscite, asking the French people to approve his actions and grant him the power to write a new constitution. This was a direct appeal to the people, bypassing the corrupt politicians he had overthrown. Louis Napoleon held his plebiscite under conditions that were hardly fair. The army voted first to set the example, and the ballot was not secret. With no real opposition allowed and the alternative presented as a return to chaos, he won a massive 92% yes vote. He now had his mandate. He used it to create a new constitution that made him a virtual dictator, a prince-president serving a 10-year term. The legislative bodies were reduced to rubber stamps. The coup was legitimized by the will of the people. This fig leaf of a republic lasted less than a year, exactly 1 year after the coup. On December 2nd, 1852, a second vote was held. Should the empire be restored? Once again, the nation voted yes by an overwhelming 97% margin. He was proclaimed Napoleon III, Emperor of the French. He chose the title III to create a sense of dynastic continuity, acknowledging his uncle's son. The Second Republic was buried, replaced by the glittering, ambitious, and controversial Second French Empire. Napoleon III didn't just rule Paris. He possessed it, demolished it, and rebuilt it. His most visible legacy is the physical transformation of his capital. The Paris he inherited was still a medieval city, a dark, overcrowded, and unsanitary labyrinth of narrow streets where sunlight rarely touched the ground. It was a breeding ground for diseases like cholera and for revolution, as these streets were easily blocked by barricades. He was determined to create a new Paris, a city of light, hygiene, and order. To execute this vision, he gave Baron Georges Eugene Haussmann near-total power to modernize the capital. For 17 years, Haussmann acted as the emperor's iron-willed foreman, undertaking a vast program of creative destruction. Medieval slums were torn down, their residents displaced. In their place, Haussmann carved the wide, straight, tree-lined boulevards that define Paris today. He created grand public parks like the Bois de Boulogne and established a unified architectural style for the city's apartment buildings, a complete demolition of the old world to build the new. But this modernity came at a social cost. The working poor, who had once lived side by side with the wealthy in the city center, were pushed to the peripheries, creating the geographic class divide that still characterizes Paris today. The city became a stage for the bourgeois, a glittering spectacle of consumption and display. This transformation wasn't just for beauty. It was a project rooted in science and social control. The wide boulevards brought in light and air, which, combined with a new sewer system, ended the era of mass cholera epidemics. Critically, the strategic design served a military purpose. The straight avenues made it impossible for rebels to build effective barricades and allowed for the rapid deployment of cavalry and artillery to crush uprisings. It was urban planning as counterinsurgency. Was Napoleon III secretly a socialist? This question lies at the heart of his Bonapartist ideology. While he was an absolute autocrat, his economic policies were surprisingly progressive. He poured state money into massive infrastructure projects and social works. He was influenced by utopian socialist thinkers like Saint-Simon, who believed that prosperity should be engineered by an enlightened elite, and that the state had a moral obligation to intervene in the economy to improve the lives of the working class. He was the first developmental dictator of the modern era. The Second Empire was an era of unprecedented economic boom. The state guaranteed loans and provided subsidies for industrial projects. The railway network exploded, expanding from 3,500 kilometers to over 16,000, creating a national market and fueling the growth of industry. Napoleon III championed the creation of new investment banks, such as the Crédit Mobilier, which pooled savings to fund large-scale ventures. This state-backed capitalism transformed the French economy. This prosperity was showcased to the world in the glittering Universal Expositions of 1855 and 1867. These were not just trade fairs. They were statements of imperial power, where the crowned heads of Europe came to marvel at French industry, art, and the sheer undeniable wealth that the empire had generated. It was also the birth of consumer culture, symbolized by the rise of grand department stores like Le Bon Marché, where the newly wealthy bourgeoisie could flaunt their status, buying the silks and luxuries that the new factories produced. Inspired by his early socialist ideas, Napoleon III's government actively pursued social reforms. He sponsored social housing for workers, funded public parks, and established mutual aid societies. Most remarkably, in 1864, he legalized the right for workers to strike the Olivier Law, a right forbidden since the Revolution. While partly a political move to win support, it reflected his genuine belief that the emperor was the protector of the working class against the selfish interests of the liberal bourgeoisie. After a decade of absolute rule, the emperor began to slowly give power away. Was this a genuine change of heart or a desperate political move? Likely both. The 1860s brought new challenges: the disastrous Mexican adventure, trade disputes, and a unified Italy. The political opposition was finding its voice again, and the emperor's health was failing. Facing growing opposition, Napoleon III began the liberal empire reforms. He relaxed press censorship and gave the parliament more say in the budget. This culminated in 1870, when he appointed a liberal prime minister, Émile Ollivier, transforming the empire into a functioning constitutional monarchy. A plebiscite in May 1870 overwhelmingly approved these reforms, giving the emperor a new mandate just months before his total collapse. On the world stage, Napoleon III wanted to redraw the map of Europe and break the conservative concert of Europe. He wanted to restore French influence. His first major opportunity came in the East. He saw the decay of the Ottoman Empire as his chance to assert French power and prestige. The Crimean War was the first great European conflict since his uncle's time. Napoleon III maneuvered France and Britain into a war against Russia. The war was bloody but ultimately successful. The 1856 Congress of Paris, held on his home turf, was the zenith of Napoleon III's reign. He had defeated Russia and made himself the undisputed arbiter of European politics. He then turned to Italy. A believer in the principle of nationalities, he championed Italian unification. He struck a deal with Piedmont Sardinia to drive Austria out of northern Italy. In 1859, he led his army to victory at Solferino. However, the sheer scale of the carnage horrified him, and he abruptly made peace with Austria, angering his Italian allies, but cementing his reputation as a powerful, if unpredictable, leader. But then, an emperor of France tried to create a client empire in Mexico. This bizarre episode became his greatest blunder. He saw an opportunity in the Mexican Civil War, where the government had defaulted on debts. He convinced Britain and Spain to join an intervention, but they soon withdrew when they realized his true intentions. He was driven by the concept of Pan-Latinism, the idea that France had a duty to lead the Latin peoples of the world against the rising Anglo-Saxon tide. Mexico was to be the jewel in this new crown, a beacon of French culture in the New World. In 1861, Napoleon III launched a full-scale invasion of Mexico. He dreamed of installing a European monarch to create a vast Catholic empire in the Americas to counter the United States. He chose Archduke Maximilian of Austria for this impossible job. In 1864, Maximilian and his wife arrived in Mexico City, backed by the French army, to rule as emperor and empress. The plan was a complete disaster. Mexican Republicans led by Benito Juarez waged a relentless guerrilla war. The French army found itself bogged down. Napoleon III had gambled heavily on the American Civil War, hoping a Confederate victory would leave the United States too divided to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. It was a fatal miscalculation. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the reunited U.S. demanded France get out. With the U.S. massing troops on the border and opposition mounting at home, Napoleon III had to fold, facing a humiliating geopolitical checkmate. In 1867, French troops withdrew, shamefully abandoning Maximilian to his fate. The Empress Carlotta had already returned to Europe. Frantically and unsuccessfully pleading with Napoleon III and the Pope for help before suffering a complete mental collapse. Maximilian, bravely but foolishly, refused to abandon his empire. He was soon captured by Juarez's Republican forces. Despite pleas for clemency from across Europe, he was tried by court-martial and executed by a firing squad in Querétaro. News of the execution shocked the world and haunted the Tuileries. Édouard Manet would immortalize the scene in a painting that the French censors immediately banned. It was a bloodstain on the regime that no amount of diplomatic spin could wash away. The fiasco was a profound international humiliation for Napoleon III, exposing the limits of his power and shattering his aura of invincibility. It signaled the beginning of the end for the Second Empire. How does a single telegram lead to the collapse of an empire? This is the story of the EMS telegram, a masterpiece of sabotage by Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia. Bismarck wanted to unite Germany under Prussian leadership. He knew he needed a common enemy to rally the German states: France. Prussia was the new power in Europe. Bismarck needed a pretext to provoke France into declaring war. He found it in the succession to the Spanish throne. A German prince was offered the crown, terrifying France with the prospect of encirclement. For a Frenchman of the 19th century, this was the ultimate nightmare scenario. It recalled the days of Charles V, when France was squeezed on both sides by the House of Habsburg. The strategic map of Europe seemed to be closing in like a vice. The prince withdrew, seemingly a diplomatic victory for France. But Napoleon's government overplayed its hand, demanding a guarantee that the candidacy would never be renewed. The Prussian king politely refused. Bismarck took the king's report of this meeting and edited it to sound insulting. He released this EMS telegram to the press. the French public exploded in nationalist fury. Napoleon III, sick and hesitant, was pushed by his ministers and public opinion into declaring war on Prussia in July 1870. France had walked right into Bismarck's trap. The emperor led his army from an open carriage, often in agony from bladder stones. He was a ruler in name only. Within weeks of the declaration of war, the entire army and the emperor himself were captured in a stunning military debacle. He reportedly rouged his cheeks to hide his deathly pallor from his troops, riding slowly into the line of fire, seeking a soldier's death that the Prussian guns refused to grant him. The Franco-Prussian War was a catastrophe. The French army was poorly organized and unready. Prussians, under Helmuth von Moltke, were a marvel of efficiency. They mobilized with clockwork precision, utilizing the telegraph and railway networks in ways the French commanders, stuck in the tactics of the past, could not comprehend. They possessed superior artillery that decimated the French forces from a safe distance, marking the catastrophic end of French military supremacy in the 19th century. At the Battle of Sedan, on September 1, 1870, the main French army, with Napoleon III, was surrounded. Trapped and shelled relentlessly, the situation was suicidal. To prevent a bloodbath, Napoleon III ordered the white flag. An entire army of over 100,000 men, along with its emperor, was now a prisoner of war. The era of the Bonapartes was finally, irrevocably extinguishing. The Second Empire vanished overnight. When news of the capture reached Paris, the government was overthrown. Republican leaders proclaimed the Third Republic. The Empress Eugenie fled the palace. She escaped through the galleries of the Louvre, aided by the Austrian ambassador and her American dentist. A surreal and undignified end for the woman who had once set the fashion for all of Europe's royalty. The reign was over, ended by simple, humiliating irrelevance. After his release from captivity, Napoleon III lived his final years in exile in England. He died in 1873 following surgery. He was a forgotten man, an anticlimactic end for a life of such high drama. His only son would die a few years later, fighting for the British, extinguishing the Bonaparte line. Queen Victoria herself visited the fallen emperor. A final gesture of respect from the monarch who had once been his wary ally, marking the end of an era. So who was he? A dictator who crushed democracy, or the visionary who built modern Paris? He was without question a dictator. He came to power in a violent coup. He destroyed the Republic, and for the first decade of his rule, his regime was a thoroughly repressive police state. His legacy is a profound paradox. He was Napoleon the Small, the tyrant who proved Marx's thesis that history repeats as farce. He led his country to its greatest military humiliation, losing Alsace and Lorraine, a wound that would fester until World War I. The loss of these provinces draped the statues of Strasbourg and Paris in black veils of mourning. That would remain until 1918. It birthed the era of revanchism, a deep, burning desire for revenge that would warp French politics for 40 years. But he was also the great modernizer. He forged the beautiful Paris we know today. He gave France its railways and modern banking. He was the socialist emperor who granted the right to strike and invested in the poor. He was the architect who replaced the church spire with the smokestack as the symbol of French power. Under his reign, the quiet agrarian rhythms of the past were drowned out by the roar of steam engines and the clatter of the loom. His fall led to the creation of the Third Republic, which finally cemented republicanism in France. He was, perhaps, the necessary tyrant, the authoritarian bridge that dragged France from its revolutionary past into the modern industrial age, setting the stage for the First World War, a conflict that would eventually consume the entire continent. Ultimately, Napoleon remains the most enigmatic figure in French history, a man who was both a hero to the poor and a destroyer of liberty, a builder of cities and a loser of wars. His story is a reminder that history is rarely black and white, but painted in the complex shades of gray that define the human ambition for power. He lived in the shadow of a giant, and while he never grew tall enough to cast a shadow as long as his uncles, he fundamentally reshaped the ground upon which modern Europe was built.